Many of us spend more than 3 hours playing them each day. You've probably heard your parents tell you off for playing them too often, and it's a well-known fact that video games are often blamed as the cause of violent outbursts. In fact, just last year, the popular video game franchise Call of Duty was blamed as the cause of a massacre in a US Navy base. And the release of brutal video games such as Grand Theft Auto continue to spark controversy among parents, controversy that is invariably fueled by the media. But surely, video games couldn't make someone killed, right? Do video games really make us more violent? We traveled down to the University of Waikato to interview Dr. Gareth Scott, who has conducted research of his own on this issue. Hi, I'm Josh.
Are games violent? Well, at one level you can say, well, no, you input into a game by pressing buttons, so there's no physical activity. If you look at the definitions of violence or aggression, they're often, sort of hostile acts towards another person in order to harm or and they often use the word physical harm of another person. Well, there's nobody being caused any harm here. It's a representation or a simulation of violence. But it's not just a simulation of violence, it's actually using violence as a kind of mechanism within a game. And a game is a rule system. Even in a violent encounter in a game, there is an AI system attached to enemies, which means possibly you have to shoot them 4 times before they stop. And if you don't shoot them 4 times, they'll keep coming at you, you'll lose your life, and the game will fail.
As the player, gamers take less notice of the blood on the walls and the bodies on the floor than someone who is simply observing the game, like a parent. The player is more focused on the health and stamina of the character, the map, and other elements of the heads-up display. There is always a clearly defined objective that the player has in mind. Due to this difference in experience, it might be easier to understand why most gamers firmly believe that there are no adverse effects that come from playing violent video games. We decided to ask the parents of the community what effect they think the violence in video games has on their children.
I'd have to say it's part of the ingredient to the troubles.
I think some people's personalities lend themselves to, if they're playing those games, to perhaps becoming more violent.
If there is violence, what it does is it desensitizes the person to violence. And therefore, the person indirectly becomes violent.
If you put violent stuff into your mind because you're looking at violent video games or violent movies or reading violent books or whatever it is, it does affect what you say and what you do.
The person doesn't realize that in real life, if they shoot someone, it causes pain and harm, because they've been doing it so easily and constantly through video games.
People have just gone into it with guns and killed, and they almost mimic the way that video games are portrayed.
A lot of time on video games is actually creating a surrounding which would influence the player. So I would agree with the fact that no matter what the other experts might have to say.
Unlike gamers, parents appear to be largely against the inclusion of violence in video games. But where have these differing perceptions come from, and is there necessarily any truth to them?
We did this really interesting piece of research with parents back in 2010, and we got 20 parents to play Grand Theft Auto 4, and they did not want him. They went bright red, they were embarrassed because they realized they weren't going to be very good, they didn't know how to play the game. And it was absolutely fascinating because a lot of the parents said, I should have done this 10 years ago. This was amazing. They thought they were frightened what they were going to experience because they heard all these things about Grand Theft Auto. Their experience was completely different. They actually realized the game was satirical, it had depth to it, it wasn't what they thought it was going to be. They didn't realize they had the freedom to do things. They didn't realize there were consequences, that you couldn't just be out and out bad, that you would get chased by police and all these kind of things. It was just really fascinating that they just had a completely different impression of games. As yet, there's no real evidence that that is the case. So there may be a link, but that hasn't been shown sufficiently. Or I'm not convinced by the way that research operates that it actually shows it convincingly. You'd think, well, if there's a link here, that the body would become excited in scenes where there's conflict or violence. but those aren't the things that trigger the excitement in the player. The things that trigger excitement are the new missions, the information, anticipation of what's coming up, being in transit in the back of a van, knowing that you're going to get out in a minute and you don't know what you're facing. It's all those kind of elements that trigger the excitement in players, and it's very rarely the conflict itself, because once you're in the conflict you kind of know what you have to do, what buttons to press.
This view that there is no correlation is shared by researchers all over the world. For instance, the University of Glasgow conducted a survey of 11,000 children in the UK and discovered exposure to video games had no effect on kids in terms of behavior, attention, or emotional issues. And while the parents are not correct, they are not to blame either. These perceptions have been built upon misinformation about the nature of video games. Each time a new form of media that possesses mature themes is introduced, it is used as a scapegoat to shift the blame from the people themselves and the flaws of society.
Aggression, for example, definition of aggression often include inappropriate behavior which is out of context, out of kilter with society, culture and situations that people are in which a person acts in a way that's socially unacceptable towards another. If you look at it in the context of a game, the player is acting in a way that's actually appropriate to the context. They're doing what's demanded. It's not out of context. It's in line with what the game wants from you.
Often the reason behind brutal acts of violence is psychological issues. Heavy metal, comic books and even chess receive the same treatment as video games today. Yes, chess was considered to be the violent video game of the 1800s.
And that's why it's kind of really sad when you see, like the Norwegian example, when they cite Call of Duty in that particular sort of massacre, which was horrendous. It kind of creates a scapegoat out of something and kind of gives us something to sort of explain something that was quite horrific and something quite complex and something that took years and something that was part of that person's persona and and background and culture and political beliefs and whatever, and it kind of reduces it to something overly simplistic like a game.
At a time when video games really are the most advanced form of media, juggling elements of great story, gameplay and presentation simultaneously, it seems a little silly to be so hung up on its one aspect: violence. Especially when you consider the incredible stories you can unfold, the characters you can meet, the adventures you can journey on, and the experiences you can share with friends. Video games really are a whole lot more than just violence. So to the parents, have no worries when your children are playing violent video games. It's not really violence at all.